It is a privilege to be here with you this afternoon, my time, Central European time, to talk about a topic that is near and dear to my heart. My name is Miriam, and I come to you from the Center of Creative Leadership. And I will be talking to you today about inclusive leadership and how best to foster it. We have about 45 minutes for this workshop. It's going to be interactive, so please make sure you have a pen and paper ready to take some notes and some reflections. There will be some reflection moments, there will be some polls, there will be a breakout. So I do encourage you to engage as much as you possibly can. I said this is a topic that's near and dear to my heart, and it very much is, and I'd like to tell you why. My father is from Somalia. He's a tall, beautiful, influential, handsome, intriguing, proud Black African man. And my mother is from California in the United States. And she is this little itty bitty, tiny, redheaded, blue-eyed, feisty, curious, courageous American educator with Irish origins. My father is Muslim, my mother's Protestant, and they sent me to Catholic school. So I grew up across 3 continents, across multiple languages, different educational systems, across religions, across skin colors. So you might imagine that for me, it wasn't always very easy or obvious to feel included in all those settings. And you would be right. It wasn't, and it still isn't. Because I'm not a part of any one group. I'm part of many groups, but I'm never really part of one group, and I rarely am part of a dominant group. And feeling included for me has always been something I've worked at. It's been a challenge, and it's been something I've been paying attention to my whole life. This idea of how to create inclusive spaces where people can thrive. It's been part of what I've always worked on. So the reason I tell you this story, not just to share of myself, but it's also because I realize I've had the privilege, I've had the benefit of needing to be strategic about inclusion. Not everyone has had that privilege, and there are many who don't think about it at all, and there are some who do think about it but want to know how to do it better, how to do inclusion better. The thing is that when we believe that inclusion is important and we can feel the impact of inclusion, then we can get better at doing what needs to be done in order to nurture it. When we are more aware of the power of inclusion and its impact to empower people to bring their whole selves to whatever it is that we're doing, we're more likely to be more intentional, to paying attention to our inclusion efforts, to make it a priority, to be strategic about it. When we are more aware of our own relationship with inclusion, when we feel included, when we feel excluded, then it's easier for us to see when others are too. It makes us more empathetic leaders. And when we're more aware of the various concrete steps that we can do, that we can actually put in place to foster inclusion on a daily basis, we're going to be more likely to do so every day a little bit more, because inclusion is a process. It's not a one-off. So the idea today is that we spend some time thinking about this space and learning together. These are the objectives for the session. One of them is about building self-awareness around inclusion, of our own sense of inclusion. Having a concept, this leadership mindset of growing our self-awareness on a continuous basis is something I'd really like to encourage in this session. The other objective that we're going to be looking at is around exploring the social structures that exist, that feed inclusion, but that also feed exclusion. And that exclusion gets in the way of the ability of individuals to actually thrive. So we want to look at those social structures that are at play. We're going to be exploring drivers that actually help to build and foster inclusion. And I want you to leave here with some very concrete steps to add to those I'm sure you already have, that can help you continue to nurture inclusion. So that's the idea for the next little bit of time we have together. And in order to get started and make it personally relevant for you, I want you to do some personal reflection right now. I would like you to think about the contexts in which you feel most included. Included meaning heard, valued, respected, safe. And I want you to think about what they look like and what they feel like. So I'll give you just a couple of examples to help you understand what I'm asking you to think about. With my immediate family, my husband, my sons, and my mother, I feel included. What about that? What about it it's because I feel accepted. I feel compassion, I feel support, I feel that they're loyal, but I also feel that they champion me. I can tell you that I have a group of long-term colleagues with whom I feel very included, because with them, I'm not afraid of being judged. We've nurtured this space of intellectual friction, but not social friction. We can think outside the box, we can challenge one another, and we give each other feedback. So those are two examples. I want to be quiet for a minute so that you can think about those contexts. And I would really appreciate it if you could put some of those in the chat so that we can start to have a bit of a conversation as well. Okay. I would love to hear back from you. Thank you, Bridget. I feel most included when my contributions are acknowledged and recognized. Yeah, and that can happen in our professional workspaces as much as it can happen within our families or any other space in which we work and live. Thank you, Bridget, for sharing that. Others? Would love to see more contributions in the chat to make this a real workshop. Go ahead and put some comments there. Yeah. When people actually ask for my insights, yes, when people are reaching their hand out to you and saying, share, speak up, exactly. Paula, great point. When there are people with whom I can relate, yes, when we have some type of similarity, something in connection, makes us feel more included, makes us feel safer, more likely to engage. Thank you so much. Thank you. Shared experiences, wonderful. Okay, now, why do I start off this way? Because this is the way that inclusion starts, all right? I really wanted to have this moment of reflection for you to draw your attention to that leadership mindset of continuously building our self-awareness, right? In this case, around inclusion. So thank you so much for sharing. And I really encourage you to take note as you go forward in your careers and personal life as well, of when you feel included and identify why, what is making it that way. Because we can nurture and replicate those contexts around us. This is a space where you have agency, where you can learn from one space and transfer it or translate to another, okay? All right. So let's look at these social structures, though, that exist, that get in our way, or that actually leverage those feelings of inclusion. I'm talking about these social structures, I'm talking about in-groups and out-groups. The tricky thing is about in-groups and out-groups is that we can actually belong to more than one, and sometimes the borders between them are not so clear. So what do I mean by in-groups? In-groups can be thought of as a group whose members are actively being included, where they have a sense of belonging and respect, where their full selves are rewarded and celebrated. Their membership in that group is not questioned. They can identify with each other for various reasons. And for those of you who attended Dr. Tompkins' session before around authenticity and social identity, these reasons can be for various aspects within our identity. They can relate to gender, to race, to religion, to geography, to profession, language, parenthood, cultural interests. This goes back to the participant Paula's comment about where there are people that I can relate to, where there's something in common. And the in-groups can be based around a variety of those, or maybe just one. The thing about in-groups is that they provide this sense of unity, of strength, but also of power. And whether we know it or not, we feel this sense or need to nurture, to consider, to prioritize, and to protect that in-group. We might also feel a sense of competition, though, with those who are not in that in-group, or at the very least, a lack of consideration for those who are not in that in-group. And this is where this self-awareness becomes really important. I'm going to ask you to think about in-groups and out-groups that you've observed around you in a moment. Let me just give you an example again to help you along. So, two of my personal examples. In a place where I worked for about over 10 years as a member of faculty, there were those of us who had a shared educational background. There's this kind of a little clique. We had all higher university degrees around political science, and there was this little in-group. And people who were in the out-group were those who had other studies, who had done other studies, or had other levels of degrees, whether they were the doctorates or whether they were the administrative staff. But there was this little clique. So that's a professional space example. Personal space example. I grew up in Djibouti in East Africa, and I was part of a group of students who are of mixed race. As I mentioned before, my father is Black African, my mother is white North American, and I was part of this group of mixed race students that, yes, we were drawn to one another because we could relate to one another, but also people put us in that box. They even labeled us, and they would call us les métis. Ah, voilà les métis. Here come the métis. So you can see in both those examples how in-groups relate to and they can differ by context. So even though we can be part of various in-groups, even at one specific space, so for example, at work, you can be part of various in-groups. You could be part of the group that has a specific area of study as much as you could be part of the in-group of the people who have small children who all want to talk about the challenge of having small children. But you could also be in the small group of, for example, women who are sitting in high positions of positional authority. Those are all types of in-groups. Out-groups are recognized in that they're not inside that in-group circle, and they're excluded from the in-group. Whether we do it consciously or unconsciously, there are things that surface. Again, an example. In this place where I was telling you I was working before for a long time as a faculty member, very diverse organization, lots of mother tongues, different languages spoken. The groups that would form tended to be around nationality or language group. But what was very interesting was how even if you did speak that language of another group, you weren't let into that in-group. What was the impact of that in-group? Oh, wow, the power that they generated in terms of giving each other access, whether they realized it or not. It was clear there was more candor around them. They were listening more deeply to each other. They were giving each other opportunities, whether it was literally just a seat next to them in the cafeteria or whether it was access into a committee. They would join the same committees. They would talk openly about activities that they were holding outside of work. A clear in-group with various people being part of the out-group. So again, very important to recognize here is that sometimes these behaviors that create feelings of inclusion and exclusion are done consciously or intentionally, and sometimes they're unconscious and not intentional. Why are we talking about this? Because for us as leaders, in order to lead inclusively, we need to be able to gain awareness about these in-groups and out-groups, about how individuals within them and outside of them are engaging interpersonally, so that we can better leverage acts of inclusion and address acts of exclusion. Okay, so personal reflection for personal relevance. Let's go back to that leadership mindset of building awareness. And I'd like you to take a minute and think about what in-groups and out-groups you have observed in your organization. I'm going to be quiet for about 40 seconds, and then I'm going to ask you to start typing into the chat just a profile description of what those groups look like. If you were to give them a little name, so to speak. Yeah, excellent, Iman. Longevity, right? History, people who've been around, who have a lot more institutional history. Definitely an in-group. And this is where it's interesting. Paula says exactly the same. So you start to see similar in-groups across organizations. Yes, English speakers versus non-English speakers, exactly. HQ, team-based, yes. Now the follow-up question to this, of course, is what is the impact of membership? And this is something we're going to be talking about going forward. Technical versus non-technical. Yes, thank you, Claire, indeed. The impact of the membership, depending on where you sit or stand, whether you're inside that circle or outside that circle, it's about remembering that membership can motivate or demotivate. It can create space for connection, for innovation, different faith. Thank you, Ashura. Exactly. Age. Oh my gosh. Yes. Creating space for connection and innovation, or it does the opposite. The power, the impact that membership in those in-groups and out-groups requires your attention and reflection. All right. It can make you decide that you feel like getting up and going back to work or going back to bed. Okay. So hopefully you have that pencil and paper around and you're writing down, okay, let me think about the impact of membership in these different groups. Because remember, the impact can also be very empowering. So our jobs, especially when we are responsible for others and we have teams that we're leading, is to be aware of those in-groups and out-groups. So we can look at what's happening within the groups to see how we can address inclusion and exclusion, all right? How they impact us. It sheds light onto what we refer to as the shadow of exclusion. What do I mean by the shadow of exclusion? Well, let's already understand what exclusion actually is. It's an act or a state of being disregarded from groups. And it negatively has an impact on our socio-emotional levels. Believe it or not, there are actual studies that show that acts of exclusion can make us feel pain, physical pain, the same way being physically hurt would. All right? It's the same as being physically harmed or hurt. It's very powerful. Factors that come into play when we're talking about exclusion, again, go back to social identities. Who ends up in an in-group or an out-group? You know? But they also have to do with our biases and our preferences. Now, in its most toxic form, this is not always the case of what we see in our workspaces, but in society, we do see this. In its most toxic form, exclusion ends up including the use of power and privilege of a dominant group to actually put in place to rationalize the disenfranchisement of individuals or groups of people. Now, this is usually based on skin color, ethnic group, language groups, religion, gender, and we've seen this throughout history in every country on this planet, all around the world. All right. So the acts of exclusion actually equate to physical pain, and we need to pay attention to them as leaders. Why? Because there's this nasty little slippery slope that can occur. Yeah, not about exclusion on a smaller scale, but it might start with actually having, you know, a small bias towards certain social identities. And then if our biases aren't addressed, we might continue perpetuating some microaggressions or discomfort. And those might devolve into appropriate jokes or slurs, which can devolve into more concrete beliefs around various groups of people and acts of then macroaggressions, discrimination. And what we continue to see all around the world is these can actually lead to violent attacks on specific individuals or groups. There's these moral implications that come into play when in-group and out-group distinctions are not thought through in a cognitive way. We're not paying enough attention to them. We dispense judgments more harshly for those who are in out-groups than we do for our in-groups. We're more patient, we're more understanding for those in our in-groups. All right, we will give more opportunities, like I mentioned before, to those within our in-groups. So the idea here that I really want to drive home is that as leaders, we need to be thinking about the power of those in-groups and out-groups so that they don't enter slippery slopes that end up in more exclusion in a more concrete way. So what can we actually do as leaders to create a culture of inclusion? There are many important characteristics and behaviors and qualities of an inclusive leader. And at CCL, we focus in on 3 when it comes to driving inclusion. And I'm going to walk us through the 3, and here they are. 1 is around connection, 1 is around courage and vulnerability, 1 is around resources and investment. Connection. What do I mean by connection? We're going to start here. Connection, we all do it all the time. But before we break into that, I want to ask you real quick, and I'm going to ask our producer to put a poll up. I want you to reflect on whether or not you can show up as your full, authentic self at your workplace. So it'll come up in just a second, that poll. I want you to reflect on that. Poll, please. Super. I like the use of the chat. Go for the chat. Thank you. All right. The producer's gone ahead and put up the poll. If you could vote, it would be very helpful. Thank you so much. Even those of you who put your answer in the chat, it would be great to see a collective response all at once. Okay. Super. So we can go ahead and share the results. 100% have answered. Thank you so much. So, excellent. You should see the results now. What do we see? Are there any surprises here that the majority of us would not say that we strongly agree? And we don't. We don't. The majority of us do not agree that we can fully show up as our full authentic selves at our workplace. Why does this matter? Why is it relevant for inclusive leadership? The reason why is because when we can show up as our full authentic selves, we can engage more easily. We generally bring forward more energy. We feel a sense of belonging. We feel more connected to colleagues. We're more likely to perform at a higher rate. But yes, indeed, Iman, I am surprised that a large group of attendees are women and that we all agree. It is heartening to see. And then we need to think about who's attending the workshop today and who's attending this global conference and all of those women who are not. Yeah. So my question then is, how can we help this along? Let's look at these drivers a little bit more deeply. All right. Connection as an inclusive leader. What do we mean by connection? How can we foster these environments? Connections can take place in various ways. On a one-to-one way, it could be a handshake. It could be a focused gaze. How often are we conscious that we're doing these things, that we are actually engaging in these behaviors? A handshake, a conscious gaze, an affirmation. An affirmation means, well done on that presentation. It was very thorough. I learned something new. Intellectual encouragement. Interesting concept you brought forward. Nice to have your insights. A prayer. I hope that you are well and your family as well. Sharing of yourself, acknowledgement of a rich lived experience that you've actually have in common or you've shared. These are all ways you can make those one-on-one connections, but also to a group. What's the purpose of connection? It's to intentionally strengthen, encourage, and improve bonds, to actually open up and increase the quality of relationships. Because belonging is actually the output of inclusion. And human connection, which is a process, it relies on the skill of human interaction, but we also need to feel belonging and connection as much as we need water, food, and shelter. As human beings, we do need this. So doing so intentionally, that little how part, how can you better pay attention to group dynamics? It's about noticing similarities and differences. It goes back to not just that self-awareness, but group awareness. This is about emotional intelligence work. It's about listening effectively, learning about your team members, taking perspectives, different perspectives, putting yourself in others' shoes, managing your personal biases, adjusting your leadership style to what will be most impactful to the individual who you need to lead as well, valuing diversity. So here are some takeaway questions that I will give you in the chat. Hopefully you could reflect on when you are thinking through how you can better connect as an inclusive leader. What do you know about each individual? What do you not know? How are your biases getting in the way? What actions am I taking to build and maintain connection, trust, and respect? Yeah. Because in a climate of connection, what ends up happening is what we refer to as a psychologically safe environment, where you will see more of these 5 points in these on the slide. Increased levels of trust, more questions being asked, more feedback being sought and given, more ideas being shared, and more people asking for help. The second driver I want to talk to you about is the courage and vulnerability. courage and vulnerability, right? Leaders who are displaying this do so when they're asking hard questions, when they're acknowledging tough situations, when they're admitting failures, when they're making decisions and taking action. For those of you who haven't heard of a lady by the name of Brené Brown, I definitely recommend looking her up, who does a ton of work on studying courage and vulnerability. She's done it for the last 12 years. She has over 13,000 pieces of data. And what she says is that vulnerability is actually misunderstood as weakness, whereas it's actually the most accurate measure of courage. It's about individuals giving feedback to a colleague who hasn't asked for it but needs to hear it. It's about admitting you don't have the answers. It's about seeking input from your direct reports to show your humility. It's about seeking input from people you know you don't agree with, the non-like-minded, so that you can gain perspective. It's about stepping up to be seen, even when there are no guarantees. Brené Brown defines vulnerability as the willingness to create courageous spaces where risk, uncertainty, and emotional exposure are possible, okay? And within that, question is, what can you do to better leverage how vulnerable you are making yourself so that you can be more impactful? So some more reflection for you. The third driver, let me take you through this one. The third driver is about resources and investment, because anytime that you decide to commit to an act of inclusion, it's going to cost you time. Time is money, and it's also going to cost you emotional involvement. Yeah. So the question to you is, how can you engage in a way where you yourself are safe and feel resourced? And you need to be able to decide for yourself. But we all, regardless of our position in an organization, we do have agency here. So this is me challenging you to think about where you do have agency. What do I mean by that? Because people who are sitting in the chairs of decisions making positions and have a pen where they can decide on where money is going to go, yes, they do have more power, perhaps, in deciding how inclusion plays out. But everybody can take a role here. We have our sphere of control, but then we also have our sphere of influence. And this is a perspective that I encourage you to take forward. What is in your sphere of control and what is in your sphere of influence? Your resources do depend on your position, but they also depend on your informal authority and how you decide to engage. So if you do have positional power, then ensuring inclusion is actually in your organizational strategy and in your principles would be nice. But do you even know where you work? Are you aware of if inclusion is actually in some of the framework documents that give you those foundations for change? Who needs to be involved in decision-making? Should it just come from the top, or does there need to be more input? What processes can you put into place to allocate resources? And what types of checks and balances are there? Are there staff surveys on belonging and well-being and senses of inclusion? What about informal power? Informal power belongs to us all. Seeking and giving regular feedback. That means giving affirmations, but also adjusting to create that psychological safe space. How are you role modeling inclusive behavior yourself? How are you celebrating the diversity of staff around you? Are you storytelling? Are you sharing cultures? Are you participating in internal mentorship programs, whether they're formal or informal? Who can you seek out to put something in place? Who can you offer your mentorship to? Can you facilitate high levels of participation in meetings by rotating responsibilities so you can draw perhaps more of those passive voices? Can you participate and initiate team building activities? So you can see there are so many places where you can have agency, even if you are not in that position of positional power. So with that, with these types of resources, think about all of those things where you do have power, where you do have agency, okay? So I want to put you into some breakouts right now. And I'd like you to think about these two questions. What are some intentional steps, okay? What are some intentional steps towards inclusion you can put into place? Even if it's just one or two, when you go back to work tomorrow or later today, what are some intentional steps towards inclusion that you could put in place? And what ideas around inclusion and how to foster it will you share with others? And here I'm talking about each one, teach one. anybody who's not in this workshop today can benefit from something that you're taking back with you. What ideas can you share around you? Okay, so I am going to stop talking and I'm going to ask our producer to go ahead and send you into breakouts. Thank you, Paula. You have a good day. And I would like them to come back at 15:07, please. Telena. So the breakouts, when they come up, you'll need to perhaps press join group. Is that right, Rachel?
I think almost everyone's in them. Yeah, just for the last two folks, yeah, just click to join the group that you've been put in. Or click the breakout room button to join a breakout room at the bottom of your Zoom. Going smoothly, Miriam. We had some technical issues with some of the other sessions. There was lots of chatter, but this one's running smoothly. And when they end, you can direct them back to joining a networking table, or there'll be, I think, two other options that they can have back on the main agenda site. They could see highlights from last year's conference or watch a video about community health workers driving change.
Sounds good. We have a participant in room 4 who is all by herself. Can we shift her to a different room, please?
Looks like it was done. Thank you.
Okay, she's not joined. She just needs to click join then. And Halima, if you're with us, you can go ahead and press join to be in your breakout as well. No, we have room 1 with only one person as well.
Yes, Heli, if you are able to join back in room 1.
Okay, now there are 2.
No,
Nothing worse than having a conversation by yourself.
Doesn't really foster that sense of inclusion and belonging, does it?
No. Abdullahi, if you'd like, and Aheli, you could go back to room 1 and your colleague Evelyn is there waiting for you. Abdullahi, if you'd like to join the breakout, there's still 6 minutes of discussion. Oh, he's gone now. Okay. Go who? Would you like to join the breakout? $15:07, Telenam. Hi. You're on mute, but if you'd like to have a chance to join the discussion in the breakout, you should have an invitation. You can click join breakout.
Yeah, okay, right. But I wasn't following for an hour, that's why I'm a bit lost now. Okay, how long will it take still the conference today, please?
Rachel, I'll let you answer that.
Okay, okay.
Hi there. Let's see. Well, we have how much more time? Our closing talk should be ending at 10 minutes before the hour, this hour.
All right, okay, thanks.
So we have this session ending at 10 minutes after the hour. If you're not in India, if it's like 03 for you right now, we'll have networking rooms or highlights from our last conference for half an hour and then a closing spotlight.
Okay, thanks very much.
Yep.
Telenam, there's a participant who's alone in room 7. You might want to invite them to join a different group or place them in another group if possible. Or can we do that? Do we have the power, Rachel?
I'll do it.
Thank you.
That was my reminder that we've got 6 minutes left.
Yeah.
Yeah, it looks like that participant joined.
Thank you, Rachel.
Yeah, just little details here.
Little details. I think we have good.
We're lucky, Miriam. There were some platform issues with the other sessions, so this one's going much more smoothly.
I'm glad. Let's see. We can broadcast a message that they have 2 minutes left. I'm doing that now. Okay. Okay, Telenam, can you close the breakout rooms? I think they have 60 seconds to wrap up their conversation. Is that correct? Thank you. Super. Okay, welcome back. I think everyone's here. Let's one breakout. Okay, I hope you had a very rich discussion. I personally believe that we would all benefit from hearing a few insights about what you are going to be taking away with you, some intentional steps. So if somebody would like to speak, I would love to have a voice. And I would also encourage you to share in the chat what are some intentional steps towards inclusion that you would be putting into place. And you can please go ahead and enter those into chat. And I would love to hear at least one person's voice beside mine. Feel free to come off mute and speak. Let's make this an inclusive space.
I was just saying that something I can do more intentionally is look for where the outgroups are and pay attention to that, so that I can make the efforts to develop those connections and to bring them in, and you know, recognizing that there always will be in groups, but ensuring that the out groups aren't excluded.
Exactly. Thank you so much for sharing that, Bridget. Indeed, the more awareness we have of the social structures at play that are creating these divisions, the better we will be at fostering inclusive leadership. Anybody else? I have 1 minute left, and I would love to hear one more voice. Anybody have an intentional step that they're going to be putting in place?
I guess in our group, we didn't really talk about intentional steps that needed to be put into place, but rather experiences that we had where inclusion made a huge impact on our achievement of success.
Great. Thank you so much, Carmen, for sharing that, because I have a goodie bag for you. My goodie bag for you are kind of a structured list of questions to help you think about those moments where you have felt highly included, so that you can replicate and transfer. So I'm going to put these in the chat so that you can see them there. And if you would like to take a picture of that slide, I really don't mind, because that is